Hello there everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'll be going over Christianity in 18th to 19th century America in regards to the slave issue. What got me interested in this topic was that atheist and Christian apologists bring up the slavery issue in America, and it is largely unproductive and becomes emotional. Both sides like to under and overestimate Christianity's influence in ending slavery in America for their own particular purposes. I knew I wanted to discuss the topic, but I felt the lack of resources to do the topic justice. I then found theological historian Dr. David Torbett, who gives great insight into the history of Christian thinking on the issue in America's context in his book Theology and Slavery. He goes through two prominent Christian thinkers during the time named Charles Hodge and Horace Bushnell, one being a conservative and the other a liberal. This gives you a bit of range in their thinking. Charles Hodge was an arch-conservative Presbyterian professor at Princeton whose works still serve as an authority for Protestants, and Horace Bushnell was a Congregationalist minister who was dubbed the father of religious liberalism. Hodge believed in an inerrant interpretation of the Bible, whereas Bushnell believed that the Bible could be read in an open-ended, imaginative way, and believed one could find inspiration not just in the Bible but in the human experience. While Hodge was less strong on ending slavery, he didn't have the beliefs that the liberal Bushnell did when it came to the inferiority of black people. Bushnell thought ending slavery would lead to black people going extinct in America. Even though Hodge was a racist, and his view of an errant Bible made him understand that slavery was permitted and thus couldn't by itself be called a sin, he thought Southern racial slavery was wrong because it went against the biblical doctrine of the essential unity of all people. He couldn't see it as essentially good or that it should be permanent. Bushnell's open-ended view of the Bible, while it made him free to say slavery was an evil institution and support voting rights for blacks, it also freed him up to be for views of human nature that were new and fringe in the 19th century, such as the polygenetic theory that posited the permanent and innate inferiority of non-whites, which would scream bullshit to many biblical and erranists of the day. By the 1830s, the era of compromise was coming to a close and the era of crisis emerged. Since the American Revolution, slavery in the U.S. has been a source of tension, with guys like Samuel Hopkins noting the inconsistency in promoting slavery while asserting their own civil liberty. The sort of consensus was that acknowledged that slavery was an evil that was necessary for the time being and should be gradually ended. Whites from both the North and South assumed that blacks couldn't handle freedom and that the races couldn't actually get along, and sending freed slaves to Liberia was a better solution for the racial problem. Many Northerners and Southerners didn't like abolitionists because they thought they were violence makers. It was during the 1830s that they made their statements on slavery. Hodge believed that the Bible was a compendium of facts that had to be studied with induction. Hodge owned a slave once. Hodge affirmed a moderate conservative position that the existence of slavery within the borders of the U.S. was unfortunate and should be changed, and he didn't defend African slavery in the U.S. but involuntary servitude, i.e. an obligation to labor for the benefit of the master without the contract or consent of the servant. The problem he had with the South were its laws forbidding educating slaves, which interfered with their marital and parental rights, along with got them oppressed. He hoped that by reforming the system to be more humanitarian, that would cause a change of heart and that would end the system. Hodge didn't affirm racial equality, but he believed that African slaves were still humans and that they could still be saved by the Gospels, thus potentially, but albeit not assuredly, be okay in America afterwards. Bushnell believed religious truth was too great to be contained in rigid logical formulas. Bushnell made his first major statement on slavery as part of a lecture, and it was to a divided audience. Not all New Englanders were abolitionists, as while William Lloyd Garrison was one, he was also tarred and feathered by his fellow New Englanders. He said that while he was against guys like Garrison's tactics, he agreed with them that slavery was wrong and should be done away with as soon as possible, as it deprived people of their humanity and reduces humans to tools. He also said that blacks would dwindle and become extinct like American Indians, as they will engage in vice and crime and won't be able to compete with whites. Bushnell said that while freedom opened no good door for blacks, they will at least know their manhood for a while. The difference between the two men came down to their methods of practical reasoning. They were married to certain anthropological assumptions, predominant loyalties, circumstantial considerations, and normative principles for their moral policy. All the factors go together and relate to each other. David Torbett goes over how there was three qualities that made slavery a particular institution in America, i.e. chattel slavery, southern and racial slavery is pretty unique in that. Chattel slavery is when a slave is a movable property like furniture, and the master's power over the slave was pretty much absolute. To quote, "Though chattel in the eyes of the law, the slave was still human being in the eyes of God." As contradictory as this might seem to us today, this is what American slaveholders affirmed. However inhumanely masters treated slaves, they did not as a rule understand them to be literally things or animals. Even Southern laws did not generally push the logic of chattel slavery to the extreme. Negatively, the law recognized the slave as a moral agent who could legitimately be punished for crimes. Positively, some laws existed to protect the lives and safety of slaves. However, slaves had little or no power to assert these legal rights. Slaves usually couldn't testify against a white person or protect themselves with force. Protection of the slave's humanity was up to the master. There was laws against manumission in the southern states that made it hard for masters who wanted to free their slaves to even do so. The cotton gin made slavery entrenched in southern life. Despite how concrete race seems, it has always carried inherent ambiguity. 19th century Americans have said there was anywhere from 3 to 5 great races of men. Many of the same traditions that developed and encouraged racial thinkings had elements that challenged it. Judeo-Christian traditions and even Platonic philosophy encouraged the idea of all humans being a family. However, even many people that believed everyone shared a human nature said that people differed significantly in many ways from each other. There was 3 prominent intellectual traditions for treating slavery back then, which was evangelicalism, enlightenment, and romanticism. It should be noted none of these traditions were entirely pro or anti-racist or pro or anti-slavery. People in all the traditions had different takes on it, and in the next video I'll be going more into depth over that. So for now, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise.